Alright guys, welcome back. We are working our way through our World War I unit, and in our last video we talked about the main causes of World War I. That was militarism, the alliance system, imperialism, and nationalism. Then we talked about the spark, where the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip, and then this alliance system kind of kicked in and all those countries started to go to war. Now, in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about what made World War I such a unique war. In the last video, I mentioned that the expectation from European leaders was this would be a brief war, maybe over in a couple weeks or a couple months at the most, and someone would win, and then things would kind of go back to normal. But that's not going to be the case, and we're going to try to figure out today why that was. What made World War I a unique and deadly war? So let's talk about that first issue. And before we even get into the combat, we need to figure out who's actually doing the fighting in World War I. So let's go back to our pre-war alliances. We learned that before World War I, there was this thing called the Triple Alliance, and that was Russia. Let me go back. That was Germany, Austria, and Italy, right there in the middle of Europe. Now, once the war gets going, this Triple Alliance, its name is going to change to the Central Powers because they're in Central Europe. And the main combatants for the Central Powers are going to be Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. So all these right through here. Now, you might be wondering, okay, what happened to Italy? I thought that was part of the Triple Alliance. And they were, but the Triple Alliance had been a defensive alliance only. In other words, Italy would have defended Germany or Austria, but because Germany went on the offensive, they declared war first. Italy didn't feel any compulsion to actually live up to that alliance, and they actually sat the first part of the war out and then later joined the war against their former allies because they wanted to get land from Austria right down here. So again, Central Powers, Germany, Austria, Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. There's the map. So you can see, again, Central Powers, they're right in the middle of Europe. Okay, the Triple Entente was that pre-war alliance of Britain, France, and Russia. And we learned that Britain had been not technically an ally, but a friend of France and Russia. And then they got dragged into war when Germany went through Belgium. So, the Triple Entente, now that the war is on, we're going to call them now simply the Allied Powers, or the Allies for short. This will be Britain, France, Russia, later Italy, Serbia, Romania, and even Japan is going to get involved in the war on the other side of the globe. And the reason Japan's going to get involved is there were some German colonies out in Asia that Japan felt would be easy taking because Germany would be so focused on the European part of the war. Now, you notice I didn't say anything about America yet because we won't join the Allied powers until the very end. And technically speaking, we never really did join the Allies. We were basically like an associated power. In other words, we were helping the Allies, but we didn't actually belong, legally speaking, to that alliance. So we've got the Central Powers right through here and then the Allied powers in purple. So the whole continent, with the exception of a few neutral countries, is ready for a war. And there's your kind of breakdown. Again, Britain, France, Russia, Italy on the Allied side, and Germany, Austria, and Turkey, that is to say the Ottoman Empire, because it's Turkey today, is the Central Powers. All right, now let's get into what is known as trench warfare and figure out how it developed and why it made World War I such a deadly war. So to understand trench warfare, we need to go back to Germany's plan to win World War I. And that was the famous Schlieffen Plan, right? Germany was going to send most of its army in this just blazing fast attack through Belgium, capture Paris, knock France out of the war, turn their army around, and then stop and then turn back a Russian invasion of Germany. That was the plan. And I told you in the last video it had to work perfectly to actually work. Well, no plans, of course, survive the first shot in battle, right? Things have to change on the fly. And what happens is Germany does invade quickly, but Belgium is going to put up more of a fight than Germany was expecting. And so when Germany approaches Paris, they're going to have to fight this big battle against the British and the French at a place called the Marne, which is a river. And there, the French and the British are able to hold on. and the German advance stalls. In fact, the Germans are actually pushed back a little bit. So the First Battle of the Marne is going to save Paris from being captured, and you could almost say it helps the Allies win the war ultimately, because Germany, this is like their one shot, and when they don't make it to Paris, there really isn't a plan B other than to pull back and start to dig in, defend what they've captured so far. So after the Battle of the Marne, both sides start to dig in. That is to say, they're digging fortifications and putting up barbed wire and getting ready to defend their lands. Now, this battle took place, the Battle of the Marne was so close to Paris that famously Parisian taxicabs were used to ferry soldiers up to the front lines because, again, they were that close to the city of Paris. Here are a couple of images from the First Battle of the Marne, and what you see is something that's lacking from your typical World War I battlefield. When you think of World War I, you think of those trenches, and you don't see them here because this is, again, pre-trench. It's after this battle that both sides start to dig in. Now, as both sides start to dig their fortifications and put up their barbed wire and so forth, those front lines are going to stabilize, and we're going to call it the Western Front. So the Eastern Front was basically Germany and Austria taking on Russia. The Western Front was Germany taking on Britain and France and Belgium. And the trench lines run basically from the North Sea up here all the way down to neutral Switzerland, a distance of about 500 miles. Now, there isn't, of course, a straight line of trenches. The trenches kind of wiggle back and forth. There are also multiple lines of trenches and then lines connecting those lines. It's been estimated if you were to take all the trenches that were dug in World War I on the Western Front and sort of stitch them together end on end, it would be a distance of about 25,000 miles, which is enough to go all the way around planet Earth. So these are going to be some serious fortifications. So the life for a World War I soldier on the Western Front in particular is one of living in the trenches. The purpose of the trench, of course, is to protect the soldiers. This is a war with machine guns and heavy artillery and rapid-fire rifles, and being above ground is to invite death. So you're going to kind of live and fight from the trenches. The only time you leave the trenches to go on the attack, which, as you can imagine, is going to be costly, right? Now, to see out from the trenches, you don't want to stick your head above the trench, right? That's not a good idea. So instead, you might use, say, a periscope. And periscopes were used extensively to be able to observe what's going on in front of your trenches, to watch for enemy attack and just, basically keep an eye on the enemy. Some ingenious soldiers even had what's known as a periscope rifle, which would allow you to fire a rifle that's above the trenches without exposing yourself to enemy fire. So here's a drawing of World War I trench warfare, and what you see in this is, kind of the daily routine. It's not exciting. You're exposed to the elements, so when it rains, you're getting wet. When it's cold, it's snowing on you. The mud is a constant companion, as are rats. Rats were always in these trenches looking for scraps of food that the soldiers might leave behind. These soldiers are not bathing frequently, so they're dirty. Many of them have lice. It's a very boring life, because it's not that there's constant combat. There's not. You have a lot of downtime where you're just working on the trenches and just trying to survive and not lose your sanity. One of the big fears of World War I soldiers and big dangers was by basically standing in a wet environment all the time, especially in standing water. Your feet can develop a condition that they call trench foot, and basically what's happening is the skin is beginning to just die off, and that infection begins to spread. And if it's not treated properly, it can lead to amputation, and if it really a severe case, it could spread and become septic and even result in death in an extreme case. You can see, you don't want that to happen to your feet, right? This is something every soldier fears. I mentioned that the rats were kind of a constant companion in the trenches. They just are something that soldiers had to live with. And you know, I'm not a big fan of rats. I cannot even imagine having to live with these things crawling all over you, especially when you're sleeping and things. Looking through your stuff and leaving droppings everywhere. Just really, really gross. So here are some French soldiers hunkered down in a bunker underground. These were built for soldiers to survive those heavy artillery bombardments by getting underground. And unless it was a direct impact, they're probably going to be safe in that bunker there. Here are some German soldiers, and if they look kind of like they have nothing to do, that's why World War I was such a boring war for most soldiers. World War I, it's basically like 90% boredom and then 10% just intense action and fear, because when that battle rages, you're all focused on that, and then the battle subsides, and you're just kind of sitting around, reading newspapers, playing cards, just trying to find something to do. All right, now between the trench lines, guys, you have an area known as no man's land. So between the Germans and the French, or the Germans and the British, again, that area is called no man's land. It varies tremendously in how wide it is. It could be a matter of just a couple dozen yards. It could be up to a mile. And so when you attack, you have to go through no man's land. And it's called that, of course, because it's an area you don't want to be, because you're totally exposed. Here's an example of those trench lines. This is a picture taken from the air, and you can see we've got the German fortifications here, and then I believe British fortifications on this side. In between would be that no man's land. Also notice the ground, how chewed up it is from that constant artillery bombardment. And notice that it's not a straight line trench. It kind of goes back and forth. Kind of a zigzag pattern. Here's a vision of what no man's land was like. So this had been a forest, and now it's been blasted apart, and it's just this muddy deathscape in front of you. Now, on the attack, guys, not only do you have to deal with enemy machine guns and rifles and grenades and everything else, you also have to fight your way through barbed wire. And both sides, particularly the Germans, would put up such thick, almost like hedges of barbed wire that it was very difficult to get through. It was so thick that in some places you literally couldn't even see through it. It was almost like a solid wall of barbed wire. So imagine being under fire and having to cut your way through barbed wire at the same time. All the while, machine guns are pouring fire on you. This is why attacks tended to be extremely costly and not very successful. So both sides would attempt to attack the other side across no man's land, and not much progress was made. Generally, attacks were beaten back, or whatever little ground they gained, they didn't hold for very long before being pushed back to their original trenches. So for a lot of attacks, this is where it kind of ends for soldiers. They've been killed or wounded in these pointless, almost suicidal attacks. So with this stalemate, both sides very quickly looked to technology to come up with some sort of new weapon that would do at least something to break the deadlock of trench warfare. And the first of these we're going to look at is poison gas. So when you think of World War I, you think of the trenches, but you also think of poison gas. So this is chemical weapons are really going to be used for the first time in war in World War I. Now, early on, poison gas was more of an irritant in that it would cause soldiers to choke or their eyes to water intensely, and they'd be very uncomfortable, and they would be less able to defend their trench lines. But the gases are going to be developed as the war goes on, and they're going to get worse, and ultimately they'll get very deadly as well. But it turns out poison gas is not going to be a war winner, and the reason is both sides also developed gas masks. So as long as you have your gas mask on, you have a good chance of surviving a gas attack. You just don't want to be like this guy right here. So early in the war, I mentioned it's a series of gases, kind of similar to like tear gas that's used by police today. And then later they get progressively worse. Things like phosgene and mustard gas were just awful, awful weapons that could prove extremely deadly. Now, early in the war, poison gas, the way it was actually distributed to the enemy was you would have like canisters of this gas, and you would release the gas and allow the wind to carry it over to the enemy trenches. Now, this is not going to be an effective way for two reasons. Number one, the wind might reverse direction, right? It might blow it right back to your side. And secondly, if you're using this as an offensive weapon, well, that means you basically have to fight your way through your own gases to get to the enemy. So not very effective, but certainly very intimidating. Gas was something that soldiers in World War I were terrified of because it's a weapon that's, it's just, they're weaponizing the very air that you breathe. There's nothing more scary than that. Here's a soldier who suffered from burns from exposure to mustard gas. You can see these massive welts on his body. Here are some early gas masks. These aren't going to protect your eyes, but they'll at least help you a little bit and try to ward off some of those gases. But as the war progresses, they're going to get more and more sophisticated to where they cover the entire head, they cover your mouth, the nose, the eyes, everything. Gas masks were very uncomfortable for soldiers to wear. They tended to kind of pinch at your nose. They were not easy to breathe through. The goggle part would tend to fog up, making it difficult to see. But, it's better than dying, of course. And here's a whole variety of different gas masks used in World War I. Now, gas masks were not used just for soldiers. They were also used for animals. In particular, horses were a major part of World War I, not for like the cavalry charges of the Napoleonic Wars, but rather just as basically, tractors. They're going to be pulling wagons and hauling ammunition and food and everything like that. And so you needed the horses to survive, which means developing gas masks for them. Even for dogs, too, because dogs could be used as messengers in this war. All right, so if we need to break through the enemy defenses and gas turns out to not necessarily be a war-winning weapon, what could we use? And of course, the answer is the tank. So the tank was a weapon that was first developed by the British in 1916. Here's a prototype known as Little Willie. And the goal here was basically to come up with a tracked vehicle that hopefully wouldn't get stuck in the mud in craters of no man's land, and that would be armored and also armed, so that it could defeat the machine gun bullets and also return fire. And this, in theory, would allow an attacking army to finally break through those lines. Turns out, though, that this technology, because it is in its infancy, was still pretty crude. Early tanks were extremely slow. They tended to be kind of clumsy. They tended to break down a lot. The soldiers inside the tank were, they can't hear anything because the engines are roaring inside. You've got guns going off. It's also hard to breathe inside. It's very hot. You've got the exhaust fumes. It's just an unpleasant environment. Notice how the tank is designed, though. You've got tracks that go all the way around the vehicle. This will allow tanks to kind of climb out from and in trenches and in big craters. Here's the inside of the tank. Okay, you can very cramped quarters inside the tank. Again, you've got the engine inside the tank with you, so that, along with guns that are firing, would have made the inside of the tank just crazy loud, right? They would be almost, you couldn't have a conversation. You would have to do kind of like hand signals and things like that to your crewmates. Despite their slow speed and their unreliability, the tanks were effective. Okay, they were very intimidating to the Germans. I mean, can you imagine this big lumbering steel beast coming at you and you're shooting at it and nothing happens? It just keeps coming at you at a walking pace. That would be pretty scary. All right, our next weapon, of course, would be the airplane. And let's recall that Wright brothers first flew in 1903. Well, World War I begins in 1914, so airplanes, like tanks, were still very much in their infancy. And early in the war, they tended to be kind of slow and clumsy, just like tanks were. They tend to be fragile and, almost more dangerous to the guy flying it than the enemy. But as the war progresses, the airplane will develop. They're going to get faster, bigger, longer range, can carry more weapons and bombs and so forth. And they're going to be used to scout the enemy, to shoot down other enemy planes, and of course to bomb the enemy. So we're going to go from very primitive airplanes to something that looks more like this by the end of the war. Well-built fighter aircraft that were, pretty fast. Now here's the highest scoring American ace of World War I. To be declared an ace, you had to shoot down 5 enemy aircraft. And this guy, Eddie Rickenbacker, shot down 26 enemy aircraft during World War I. Billy Bishop was the top Allied ace of the war. He was a Canadian, shot down 72 enemy aircraft, which is pretty amazing. But the #1 ace of the entire war was a German. His name was Manfred von Richthofen. He shot down 80 enemy aircraft before he himself was killed in action. He's better known as the Red Baron. So if you've ever heard of the Red Baron, that's him. And his famous triplane here was colored a bright red color to basically show off, hey, I'm here, come take me down if you can, kind of thing. He was a very skilled pilot. All right, now let's look at our last weapon system. You might recall that the British had the strongest navy in the world at this time, and so Germany has to find a way to overcome this, and their solution was to go underwater. That is to say, the submarine. Now, the German word for submarine is Unterseeboot, and that's why we get the term U-boat. And U-boats were German submarines, and they were extremely effective in World War I and World War II. While they would target enemy warships if they had the chance, their main target actually were unarmed merchant ships or transport vessels. Now this is especially scary for Britain because Britain as an island nation was not self-sufficient, and they had to import a lot of fuel and food. And so if the Germans could sink enough of those ships, Britain could in theory be starved into submission. This is what we call a torpedo. This is launched by the submarine at an enemy aircraft, or enemy ship rather. There's a fuse in the front, and there's also an explosive. If it blows up, it can really damage the ship. In fact, it could even sink it. All right, so that, guys, is our. That's all we're going to cover in this video. We talked about why trench warfare happened when the Allies stopped the German advance at the Battle of the Marne. We looked at both sides digging in those fortifications known as the Western Front. We talked about why attacks didn't succeed very well in World War I. We also looked at new technology like the tank and the airplane and the submarine. They were all, and poison gas. They were all designed to try to break the deadlock of World War I and achieve victory.